My husband's quest for justice turned into a nightmare when he took it too far. Now, our family's future hangs by a thread. Have you ever wondered how far a parent would go to protect their child? I never thought I'd find out, but here I am, caught in a whirlwind of revenge, justice, and moral ambiguity. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon when my son, Jake, came home from school with a black eye and a broken spirit. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't take it anymore." My heart shattered as I held him close, feeling his body tremble against mine. Jake had always been a sensitive soul, more interested in art and poetry than roughhousing with the other boys, but lately he'd been withdrawing into himself, his usual vibrant chatter replaced by sullen silence. "What happened, sweetheart?" I asked, gently touching the purpling bruise around his eye. He hesitated, then the words tumbled out in a rush. "It's Tommy Bradshaw again, but this time it wasn't just him. His dad was there too." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. "His father? What do you mean?" Jake's eyes welled up with tears. "After school, Tommy cornered me behind the gym. He was pushing me around like usual, but then his dad showed up. I thought he'd stop it, you know. But he just laughed and told Tommy to finish the job. Then he held me down while Tommy hit me." Rage, hot and fierce, surged through me. How could a grown man participate in bullying a child? My child? I wanted to march over to the Bradshaw's house right then and there to confront them, to make them pay. But as I looked at Jake's bruised face, I knew I needed to handle this carefully. "We need to tell your father," I said softly. Jake's eyes widened in panic. "No, Dad will freak out. You know how he gets." I did know. My husband Mark was usually the calmest person I knew. But when it came to protecting his family, he transformed into someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. "He needs to know, Jake," I insisted. "We can't let this continue." As we waited for Mark to come home, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. I had no idea how right I was. When Mark walked through the door, his relaxed demeanor instantly vanished as he took in Jake's battered face. His jaw clenched, eyes hardening into chips of steel. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. I explained the situation, watching as Mark's expression grew darker with each word. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "I'll handle this," he said finally, his tone brooking no argument. That night, as we lay in bed, I turned to Mark. "What are you planning?" He stared at the ceiling, his face unreadable. "Do you really want to know?" I hesitated. Did I? Part of me wanted justice, wanted the Bradshaws to suffer for what they'd done. But another part, the rational part, knew that violence would only beget more violence. "Just be careful," I whispered. Mark turned to me, his eyes softening for a moment. "I always am." The next few days passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Jake stayed home from school, still nursing his injuries. Mark went to work as usual, but there was a new intensity about him, a coiled energy that made me uneasy. It was on the third day that everything exploded. I was in the kitchen, absently stirring a pot of soup when the doorbell rang. Opening it, I found myself face to face with a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and cold, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Reynolds?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm Detective Sawyer. I need to ask you a few questions about your husband." My heart rate spiked. "What about him?" The detective's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where was he last night between 8 p.m. and midnight?" I blinked, caught off guard. He was here with me. We were watching a movie." "Why?" Detective Sawyer pulled out a small notebook. "And can anyone else corroborate that?" A chill ran down my spine. "Our son was home, too." "What's this about?" He ignored my question. "Has your husband been acting strangely lately? Any sudden changes in behavior?" I thought about Mark's intensity over the past few days. The way he'd been so focused. So determined. But I couldn't betray him. Not when I didn't even know what this was about. "No," I lied smoothly. "Everything's been normal. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to know why you're asking these questions." The detective studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm afraid I have some bad news. Last night, Thomas Bradshaw Sr. was found severely beaten in an alley behind his workplace. He's in critical condition at St. Mary's Hospital." The world tilted on its axis. Thomas Bradshaw Sr., Tommy's father. The man who had held my son down while his own child beat him. And now he was in the hospital, beaten within an inch of his life. I don't understand, I stammered. What does this have to do with my husband? Detective Sawyer's gaze was piercing. We have reason to believe your husband may have been involved. Several witnesses reported seeing a man matching his description in the area around the time of the assault. My mind raced. Mark couldn't have, could he? But then I remembered the cold fury in his eyes when he'd seen Jake's injuries. The way he'd said, "I'll handle this." My husband is a peaceful man, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. He would never do something like that. The detective raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Even to protect his son? I faltered, and he pounced on my hesitation. Mrs. Reynolds, we know about the incident with your son. We know Mr. Bradshaw was involved. Now, I understand the desire for justice. But taking the law into one's own hands is never the answer. I straightened my spine, pushing down the panic threatening to overwhelm me. If you don't have any more questions, detective, I'd like you to leave now. And if you want to speak to my husband, you can do so through our lawyer. After he left, I sank to the floor, my mind whirling. Had Mark really done this? And if he had, how far was he willing to go? The sound of a key in the lock made me jump. Mark walked in, looking as calm and collected as ever. But there was something different about him, a dangerous glint in his eye that I'd never seen before. Mark, I said, my voice shaking. We need to talk. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something. Regret? Fear? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that eerie calm. About what? He asked innocently. I took a deep breath. A detective was here. Thomas Bradshaw is in the hospital. They think you might have had something to do with it. Mark's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. And what do you think? I stared at him, this man I thought I knew so well. My loving husband, my son's gentle father. But now, looking into his eyes, I saw a stranger. A predator. I think, I said slowly, that you need to tell me exactly what happened last night. He was silent for a long moment, then sighed heavily. You really want to know? Did I? Did I want to know if my husband was capable of such violence? If he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Yes, I whispered. I need to know. Mark's eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a storm of emotions. Love, fear, determination, and something darker, something that sent a shiver down my spine. All right, he said. But remember, you asked for this. As Mark began to speak, I felt the foundations of my world start to crumble. He described following Bradshaw from his workplace, cornering him in the alley. The way Bradshaw had laughed when confronted about Jake, boasting about how he'd toughened up, his own son, the same way. I saw red, Mark said, his voice eerily calm. I couldn't stop myself. Every punch, every kick. All I could think about was Jake's face, bruised and beaten. I listened in horror as my husband detailed the assault, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't the man I married. This was someone else entirely. Mark, I whispered. What have you done? He looked at me, his eyes hard. What I had to do to protect our son. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, this isn't protection. This is revenge. And it's going to destroy us all. Just then, Jake appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. Mom? Dad? What's going on? Mark's expression softened as he looked at our son. It's okay, buddy. Everything's going to be fine. But I knew it wasn't. Nothing would ever be fine again. The next few weeks were a blur of police interviews, hushed conversations, and sleepless nights. Mark maintained his innocence, and without concrete evidence, the police couldn't charge him. But the suspicion hung over our family like a dark cloud. Jake, sensing the tension, withdrew even further into himself. I caught him watching Mark with a mixture of awe and fear, and it broke my heart. What kind of example were we setting for our son? As for me, I found myself caught in an impossible position. On one hand, I was horrified by what Mark had done. Violence was never the answer, and he had crossed a line that I wasn't sure we could come back from. But on the other hand, a small, dark part of me was glad. Glad that Bradshaw had suffered. Glad that he knew what it felt like to be helpless and in pain. And that terrified me more than anything else. One night, as I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep, I heard Mark's voice from downstairs. Curious, I crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky step. Can't leave it like this, Mark was saying, his voice low and urgent. They're going to keep digging. We need to end this, once and for all. My blood ran cold. Who was he talking to? And what did he mean by, end this? I know it's risky, Mark continued, but we don't have a choice. Meet me tomorrow night, same place as before, and bring the stuff. I hurried back to bed before Mark could catch me eavesdropping, my mind racing. What was he planning? And more importantly, how could I stop him before he did something he couldn't take back? The next day, I watched Mark like a hawk, not looking for any clue as to what he was planning. But he was maddeningly normal, making breakfast for Jake, kissing me goodbye before heading to work. It was as if the man I'd overheard last night was a completely different person. As evening approached, I made a decision. I couldn't let this continue. Whatever Mark was planning, I had to stop him. After putting Jake to bed, I pretended to turn in early myself. But as soon as I heard Mark's car pull out of the driveway, I was up and moving. I grabbed my keys and phone, then hesitated. Should I call the police? But what if I was wrong? What if this was all just a terrible misunderstanding? No, I decided. I needed to see for myself first. I followed Mark's car at a distance, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd be able to hear it even from separate vehicles. We drove for what felt like hours, leaving the familiar streets of our suburb behind and heading into the industrial part of town. Finally, Mark's car turned into an abandoned warehouse lot. I parked a block away, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. What was I doing here? This was madness. But I had to know. Creeping closer to the warehouse, I saw two other cars parked next to Mark's. Voices drifted out from inside, and I pressed myself against the cool metal wall, straining to hear. Sure about this? An unfamiliar voice was saying, it's not too late to back out. I'm sure, Mark's voice replied, steel in his tone. We finish this tonight. My breath caught in my throat. What were they planning? I inched closer to the partially open door, peering inside. Mark stood with his back to me, facing two other men, one I recognized with a jolt. It was Detective Sawyer. The other was a stranger, but something about his stance screamed military. All right, Sawyer was saying. Let's go over the plan one more time. We grab Bradshaw, make it look like a drug deal gone wrong, plant the evidence, stage the scene. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll be long gone. I clasped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. They were planning to kill Bradshaw and cover it up. This wasn't justice. This was cold-blooded murder. And you're sure this will work? Mark asked, his voice tense. The unknown man nodded. Trust me, I've done this before. No one will ever know the truth. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I had to stop this. But how? If I went to the police, Mark would go to prison. If I confronted him, who knows what he might do? Suddenly, a hand clamped over my mouth. I tried to scream, to fight, but whoever had me was too strong. Well, a familiar voice drawled in my ear. What do we have here? I was dragged into the warehouse, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Mark whirled around, his eyes widening in shock and horror as he saw me. Sarah. He gasped. What are you doing here? Detective Sawyer, who had been the one to grab me, shoved me forward. I stumbled, catching myself on a nearby crate. Looks like we have a little complication, gentlemen, Sawyer said, his voice cold. The unknown man stepped forward, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. This changes things. We can't leave any witnesses. Time seemed to slow down as I looked at Mark, silently pleading with him. This was it, the moment of truth. Would he choose his misguided quest for vengeance, or would he choose his family? For a long, terrible moment, Mark was silent. Then, slowly, he stepped between me and the others. No, he said firmly. This ends now. All of it. Sawyer's eyes narrowed. You can't be serious. After everything we've done, you're going to throw it all away? Mark's shoulders straightened, and in that moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with. Strong, principled, and fiercely protective. I lost sight of what was really important, he said. But I see clearly now. This isn't justice. It's just more violence, more pain. It has to stop. The tension in the room was palpable. I held my breath, waiting to see how the others would react. Suddenly, the warehouse erupted into chaos. Sawyer lunged for his gun. But Mark was faster. They grappled, the weapons skittering across the floor. The other man moved to intervene. But I acted on instinct, grabbing a nearby wrench and swinging it with all my might. It connected with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the ground. In the confusion, I managed to get to my phone and dial 911. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. As we waited for the police to arrive, Mark held me close, his body trembling. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I got lost. I forgot what really mattered." I looked up at him, seeing the regret and fear in his eyes. "We'll get through this," I said softly, "together." The aftermath was messy, to say the least. Mark turned himself in, confessing to the assault on Bradshaw, but also exposing the corruption within the police force. Detective Sawyer and his accomplice were arrested, their web of lies and cover-ups finally unraveling. As for our family, we had a long road ahead of us. Mark was sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling. Jake struggled to understand why his father, his hero, had done something so wrong, and I had to learn to trust again. To believe that the man I loved was still in there, beneath the anger and the pain. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wondered if we'd ever be okay again, but slowly, surely, we began to heal. One evening, months later, I found Jake and Mark in the backyard. They were sitting side by side on the old swing set, talking quietly. I paused at the window, not wanting to interrupt. "Dad," Jake was saying, his voice hesitant. Do you regret what you did?" Mark was silent for a long moment, and I held my breath, waiting for his response. "I regret letting my anger control me," he said finally. "I regret thinking that hurting someone else would make things better. But I don't regret wanting to protect you, Jake. I went about it the wrong way." Jake nodded slowly. "I was scared," he admitted. "Not of Tommy or his dad anymore, but of you. I thought maybe you'd changed." Mark's shoulders slumped, and I could see the pain etched on his face. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I never wanted you to be afraid of me. I promise you, I'm working hard to be better, to be the dad you deserve." Jake leaned against his father's shoulder. "I know, Dad. And I'm proud of you, for admitting you were wrong, for trying to make things right." I felt tears prick my eyes as I watched them, this fragile reconciliation. We still had a long way to go, but in that moment, I felt a flicker of hope. The next day, I received a call from the school. My heart sank, fearing the worst. Had Tommy started bullying Jake again? Had there been another incident? But to my surprise, the voice on the other end was warm, even excited. "Mrs. Reynolds? This is Mrs. Patel, Jake's art teacher. I wanted to let you know that Jake's latest project has been selected for the district art show. It's quite remarkable. I think you and your husband should come see it." Curiosity piqued. Mark and I attended the art show that weekend. As we walked through the school gymnasium, surrounded by colorful paintings and sculptures, I felt a sense of normalcy that had been missing from our lives for so long. We found Jake standing nervously by his piece, a large canvas covered in bold strokes of color. As we drew closer, I gasped softly. The painting was a swirl of darkness and light, anger and hope. In the center stood 3 figures, clearly meant to be our family, surrounded by a maelstrom of emotion. But what struck me most was the way Jake had portrayed Mark. He wasn't a monster or a hero, but a man, flawed, struggling, but ultimately reaching towards the light. "Oh, Jake," I whispered, pulling him into a hug. "It's beautiful." Mark stood silently, staring at the painting with tears in his eyes. "Is this how you see us?" he asked softly. Jake nodded, looking up at his father. "We're not perfect, Dad, but we're trying. That's what matters, right?" Mark knelt down, pulling Jake into a fierce embrace. "Right, buddy, that's exactly what matters." As I watched them, I felt something shift inside me. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued me for months began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism. We had been through hell, faced our darkest impulses, and come out the other side, not unscathed, certainly, but perhaps stronger for it. In the weeks that followed, our family began to find a new rhythm. Mark threw himself into his counseling sessions, working hard to understand and control his anger. Jake, bolstered by his success at the art show, began to come out of his shell again, even making a few new friends at school. And me? I found myself reevaluating everything I thought I knew about justice, forgiveness, and the complexities of human nature. It would have been easy to paint Mark as the villain in our story, to let the anger and betrayal I felt consume me. But life, I was learning, is rarely so black and white. One evening, as Mark and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset, he turned to me with a serious expression. Sarah, he said softly, I know I can never fully make up for what I did, but I want you to know I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you and Jake. I looked at him, this man I had loved, hated, feared, and forgiven. I know, I replied, and that's why we're still here, still fighting for our family. He reached out, taking my hand in his. Do you think we'll ever be okay, again? I squeezed his hand, considering the question. I said slowly, that okay might look different now, but yes, I think we will be. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. It had started with a parent's worst nightmare, seeing their child hurt and feeling powerless to stop it. But it had become something more, a crucible that had tested our family to its very limits. We had faced the darkness within ourselves, confronted hard truths about justice and vengeance, and ultimately chosen a harder, but more rewarding path. The path of healing, of forgiveness, of doing the difficult work to become better versions of ourselves. I don't know what the future holds for us. I can't guarantee that we won't face more challenges, more moments that test our resolve and our love for each other. But I do know this. Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together. Not as perfect people, but as a family. Flawed, complex, and ultimately unbreakable. As Jake's painting had shown, we are a work in progress, constantly evolving, striving towards the light, even in our darkest moments. And in the end, isn't that what it means to be human? To fall, to rise, to learn, and to grow? Our story isn't over. In many ways, I feel like it's just beginning. But whatever twists and turns lie ahead, I'm ready to face them. Because now I know the truth, that love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about perseverance. It's about choosing each other, every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And as I looked at Mark, at the man who had lost his way but fought his way back, I knew that's exactly what we would do. Choose each other, choose our family, choose love, every single day. The night deepened around us, stars twinkling to life in the velvet sky. And for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Whatever tomorrow might bring, we would face it together. And that, I realized, was enough. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them, so please leave a comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one.